So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. It's just gone 1 o'clock, so I'm just going to give everyone a chance to join. Do feel free to drop into the Q&A box and say hi. Just to let you know, we've disabled the chat feature as we've discovered it can cause problems for some people using screen readers. So I'm just going to leave it a few moments for more people to arrive and then we'll get started. Hi Stuart. I can see you saying hello. Hiya. Okay, lots more people joining now. I'm glad you could make it today. I'll leave it just a few more moments and then we'll get started. Okay, so I can see lots more of you have joined now, so we're officially going to start now. So hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is the Higher Education and Public Sector Update, Accessible e-learning do's and don'ts with Susi Miller. My name is Annie Mannion and I'm Digital Communications Manager at AbilityNet, and I'll be running you through what you can expect from today's session. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to go through a few bits of housekeeping, we have live captions on the webinar provided by MyClearText. So thank you, Claire, who's doing those in the background. You can turn those captions on using the CC option on the control panel. And then additional captions are also available at streamtext.net/player?event=AbilityNet. Slides are also available at slideshare.net/AbilityNet and on our website at abilitynet.org.uk/Susi-Miller. If you have any technical issues or you need to leave early, don't worry, you'll receive an email with the recording, the transcript and the slides on Thursday afternoon. And then depending on how you joined the webinar, you'll find a Q&A window. If you'd like to ask the speakers any questions, do drop those in the Q&A area and we'll address those later on or after today's session in a follow-up blog on our website. And then we also have a feedback page you'll be directed to at the end, which invites you to tell us about any future topics you'd like us to cover in our webinars. So on to the next slide, if you like. Thank you. For those of you who aren't yet familiar with AbilityNet, we support people of any age living with any disability or impairment to use technology to achieve their goals at home, at work and in education. And we do this by providing specialist advice, services, free information resources like this webinar. And I'll share a little more about our services at the end of the webinar. Okay, great. So today we're joined by Susi Miller. She's an e-learning accessibility expert and author of Designing Accessible Learning Content, which was recently released. Susi will be walking us through her accessible e-learning do's and don'ts. And also joining us is James Baverstock, who's one of our senior accessibility and usability consultants at AbilityNet. And he will be providing an update on mobile apps ahead of tomorrow's deadline for the public sector body's accessibility regulations. So just before Susi kicks off today's webinar content, I'm just going to start with a poll. So 1 moment. So can you tell us, how confident are you that you deliver accessible e-learning? Are you very confident we've perfected it? Are you quite confident we have just a few issues to iron out, but we know what we need to do? Not confident, there are a lot of problems to fix and possibly more we don't know about. Not at all confident, we don't know where to start, and then if it may not be applicable to you. So I'll leave a few more moments for everybody to respond. Depending on how you've joined the webinar, you may find you can't see the poll, but you can respond in the Q&A panel. So most people have voted now, just a couple more moments. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So the results are The most responses were quite confident. We have just a few issues to iron out, but we know what we need to do, which is great. So that's 44% of you. And then the next one down, not confident. There are a lot of problems to fix and possibly more we don't know about. That's 40%. Then 12% it's not applicable to. Not at all confident, we don't know where to start. That's 4%. And then very confident we've perfected it. Unfortunately, not everyone has, but it seems like there are still folks who'd like to find out more. So over to you, Susie, to tell everybody about how to excel at accessible e-learning.
Great, really interesting. So I don't know, yes, well, I think we're going to move on to the first slide, if that's okay, Adam. Okay. Lovely. So AbilityNet have very kindly asked me to come along today and give you some e-learning accessibility do's and don'ts. And what I'm going to do is start by focusing on some tips for e-learning content itself. I've chosen 6 do's and 6 don'ts, and they are based really on the many examples of e-learning content which I see when I do accessibility overviews or sometimes full WCAG audits. And I've chosen these examples because I think they will have the most impact on improving the experience for your learners. And I'm also going to focus on one of each of the do's and don'ts, just to draw out why I think it's so important. And hopefully that will leave you at least with 2 things that you can take away and practically apply. The next section of the presentation just focuses more on the do's and don'ts of actually implementing e-learning accessibility. But what we'll do to begin, as I say, is just start with a deeper dive into e-learning and focus on some of the do's which can really benefit your learners. So we will just start off with, as I say, the first one that I have here is probably, I think, one of the most important. It's using plain English. And I think the reason I've focused on that one is because it has benefits for so many learners. So it can benefit busy people, stressed people, second language learners, people with cognitive differences such as dyslexia, and people who use screen readers, also people who use refreshable braille displays, etc. So that the clearer and the simpler the language that we use, the better it is, I think, for all of our learners. And then the second one is to use clear and accessible fonts and formatting. So although there is a debate about which fonts are best for accessibility, I personally tend to stick to sans serif fonts such as Arial and Calibri, and at least 12-point for print and 18-point or above for presentation. So those are the kind of key things that I remember with my font and formatting. The next one is adding alternative text to any images which add meaning. So I have to say all of the e-learning authoring tools that I've used have actually allowed you to add alternative text for image. And that's of course crucial for screen reader users. So your tool should also allow you to stop screen readers from announcing images which are only used for decoration. So both, I think, are really important to make sure that your content is accessible and also to offer a good user experience for screen reader users. And the next one is making sure that all interactions and media players are keyboard accessible. And the reason I've chosen this one is because I think that keyboard accessibility is actually often overlooked because it's generally something that the tool provides automatically. But I always advise putting your mouse away and checking that you can actually access everything with the keyboard and that you don't fall into any of those keyboard traps that stop learners moving on in your learner. So I think that's a key thing for me to remember. Finally, next one is using accessible headings, lists, and tables. And this one I've chosen because really in the testing that I do, I work extensively with a screen reader user, and I'm an extremely basic screen reader user, but obviously she has been using her screen reader for many years. She has an experience, a lived experience of a disability, and she's been using JAWS for about 20 years. So I think a real light bulb moment working with her was just realizing how crucial it is to use those heading styles and the list styles, and also to mark header, rows, and tables, just to make it easier for assistive technology users to actually navigate and understand the structure of the content. Really, really important for actually helping people to kind of understand what you're trying to convey and what they're trying to learn. And the final one is making sure that text and background items have good color contrast. So this is where we go on to the next slide, please. So if you look at the e-learning slide I have here, I want you just to take a few seconds to guess whether there's good contrast between the pink of the subtitle text that reads cybersecurity quiz and the background purple. And then the same with the white, how to avoid hackers' traps. So I'm sure you probably guessed that the white had good contrast against the purple, but the pink didn't. So next slide, please. So how would you be sure? So as you can see from the image, this is where a color contrast checker is hugely helpful. Now, I always recommend the WebAIM one. I know there are lots of other alternatives, but this is one that I tend to find easiest to use and easiest to see if my color combination passes WCAG requirements. And also I like it because it has a lightness slider, which allows me to lighten and darken colors if they don't pass. So I think this is my key takeaway because, again, it has impact on so many people. So you'd imagine good color contrast is vital for people who have many types of visual impairments. Next slide, please. And this is the example of how that slide would look for someone who had cataracts. This is actually using a vision simulator here. You can see how difficult it is to read the cybersecurity quiz text now with that visual impairment. But next slide. This is the same slide, but just viewed by someone who maybe is having blurry vision. So maybe someone who's long-sighted and has forgotten their reading glasses. So, you know, I think for me that shows actually that this is a really important thing for so many people. And low contrast also makes it more difficult to see for many older people who find it harder to distinguish colors as their eyes age, or for someone who's using an old monitor, maybe with poor color contrast, or someone looking at a mobile device outside in bright light. So I think for me, that's why I've chosen to focus on that color contrast, really key for so many different people. And that brings us now on to the first of our don'ts. So if we can move to the next slide. So again, coming back to good contrast, I think a lot of people are aware actually of the importance of good color contrast between the text and the background. But one thing that does get overlooked sometimes is that contrast also on interactive items. So it's just as important for interactive items in e-learning. So things such as buttons and links. The next one is also about links. Another thing to remember with links is to make sure that they describe to your learners where they're going to take them. So for example, BBC homepage instead of click here. So again, that one is quite a common one. Quite a lot of people are aware of that, but it's a really crucial one for so many different learners to make their learner experience better, so they know exactly where they're going to go when they select links. The next one is don't create inconsistent navigation or quiz feedback. And I think that I've chosen this one as a common pitfall for e-learning. And I think that especially happens when content authors are new and maybe experimenting with the tool and trying to add in as much variety as possible, maybe to navigation and quiz feedback. So I see that quite a lot. But I think it's really important to remember that all learners benefit just from simple and consistent navigation and feedback. So that's one of my key tips. The next don't is don't use non-inclusive language. So avoid using things such as click and tap. That's because it excludes people who don't use their mouse or finger to access content. So if you can remember, it's always much better to use select instead. That's what accessibility experts suggest. The next one is another one that I tend to see quite a lot, and that is this use of text in all capital letters. And again, really very common in e-learning resources. And the reason that it's better to avoid that is because it actually makes it between 13 and 18% harder for everyone to read. And the reason is because it changes the shape of the letters. So it actually makes it more difficult to skim and scan. So that's according to gov.uk. So I think really good advice there. And finally, making sure that learners have control over any time limits. So if we go to the next slide. And I think, again, that's a key takeaway because a lot of people are aware of that, and they maybe action that when it comes to not putting time limits or allowing learners to control time limits when it comes to quizzes, for example, and the time that things are left on the slide or on the screen. But the next one, if we go to the next slide, please, It's also really important to think about when you're thinking about moving content. And I see this most often still in animated text. So this is our key takeaway, because as I say, it's still a really common feature of the e-learning content that I see. So in a moment, Adam is going to play a short video for us, and that video is going to show you a screen reader announcing the content of this slide. The yellow boxes that you'll see on the screen when the video plays shows you what the screen reader is announcing. And you'll be able to notice that even though the screen reader is set to its default speed settings, which I have to say is excruciatingly slow for an experienced screen reader user, you can see that the animated text means that there's a real risk that learners will miss content because the screen reader just won't catch it and won't read it aloud. So if you could play the video now, please, Adam.
Tab, roles and responsibilities. Tab, your HR GDPR responsibilities. Tab, here are all the things you should do, Tab, 1. Be organized when it comes to collecting, processing, and holding personal data. Tab, 2. Only collect, process, or hold data that is necessary to achieve your purpose. Tab, 3. Safeguard the confidentiality of all personal data you have contact with. Tab, next button. To activate, press spacebar.
Great. So hopefully that was, if you haven't seen a screen reader in action, that was hopefully quite interesting. But the key point really is to give your learners control over any animated text, or also to provide a static alternative. That's another option that you have. Okay, move to the next slide, please. So I hope you found that useful. And what I'm going to do now is focus on some key do's and don'ts for implementing e-learning accessibility, specifically in HE and public sectors. And I think these are really just based on my own observations and experiences working in L&D in both HE and local government for many years. And they're just some of the things which I've found personally helpful. So hopefully you will too. So if you could move to the next slide, lovely. Okay, so I think the most important thing that you can do to successfully implement e-learning accessibility is actually to work across your organization. So in other words, to work in a joined up way with teams of L&D professionals, instructional designers, or anyone using an authoring tool within an organization. This is without a doubt the best way of pooling resources and having an organization-wide strategy. But in my own experience, it's probably one of the most difficult things to try and achieve. And it's actually one of the reasons that I wrote Designing Accessible Learning Content, because I really wanted there to be a resource for people who were quite often working in very small teams or in isolation, and sometimes didn't have the strategic support of their organization, but who still felt it was really important to make e-learning accessible. So that, as I say, that's one of the reasons that I hope the book will be useful for many people. So next slide, please. So another thing that I've learned is really learning as much as you can from your learners. And I found that when I was working in HE and local government, I always had better access to learners than I was working in the private sector. And this gave me a great opportunity to learn from their feedback. So I know it isn't always possible, but if it is, I found it's the best way to learn about accessibility. And that's also a reason why, if you go to the next slide, please, I've included some case studies, learner case studies in the book. So for me, these were the kind of key learning that I wanted to include in the book. It was seeing how people actually were coping with the barriers that people were often putting in their e-learning. So really useful to always look at, go to your learners and get as much feedback as you can from them. Okay, next slide. So the next do is to work within your tool constraints. So I often used to find it frustrating, especially at L&D events, when people kind of assumed that everyone could sort of just switch tools to find a more accessible option, when I knew that often that due to resources, that simply isn't the case for a lot of people. So since then, having done a lot of research on different authoring tools, I think there are definitely some tools that are better than others, but I don't think there is any one which is perfect. So if it isn't possible to switch to an alternative tool, I do think it's possible to work within the constraints of most tools and just doing things like, really understanding how they work, how their accessibility functionality works, and also documenting tool limitations in accessibility statement, for example. Okay, next slide, please. So the final do is to remember your staff. So I found that a lot of the focus for e-learning accessibility, particularly in HE, was understandably for students, but it's just remembering that e-learning accessibility is just as important for staff who need to access things like your health and safety, your compliance, and your staff development training. Okay, next one. So the first of our do's, don't expect change to happen quickly. First of our don'ts, and this features a quote from the poet Rumi. So it's the quote is: "Patience is not sitting and waiting; it is foreseeing. It is looking at the thorn and seeing the rose, looking at the night and seeing the day." And this quote I first heard used by Lainey Feingold, who's a very well-known accessibility lawyer, and she was involved with the famous Domino pizza case. And she's an advocate from the States, and she uses this quote when she describes her attitude to accessibility and how important it is not to be frustrated by the pace of change. So I think although progress might not be quite as fast as we would like it to be, there is a growing sense, especially in the public sector, I think, that attitudes are beginning to change. The next one, please. So my next don't refers to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and their tendency to just cause frustration when e-learning professionals try and apply them to an e-learning context. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you don't need me to tell you about the frustration of trying to unpick the technical language aimed at web developers with a knowledge of coding, or how difficult it can be to try and apply all of the 50 WCAG 2.1a and AA standards to a learning context, or just how unhelpful many people find the poor principles. If we move to the next slide. This was another reason that I wanted to write Designing Accessible Learning Content, because I wanted to save as many content authors as possible from hours and hours of grappling with accessibility and trying to apply WCAG to e-learning content, just so that it became easier for everyone to do. So the book is, at the heart of the book is a contextual framework which allows people to apply WCAG in a logical order which makes sense for designing learning content. And it also translates the standards into plain English with lots of examples of using different tools, just so that everyone has a better chance of making their learning content more accessible. Which brings me to our final don't. So I think although many of us are understandably frustrated at a lack of leadership sometimes on e-learning accessibility, maybe from our institutions or organizations, in my experience, starting from the bottom up is still a very powerful approach. So in the words of Greta Thunberg, next slide, please. If you look through history, all of the big changes in society have been started by people at grassroots level, people like you and me. Okay, and that's my final slide. So yes, just that slide. I hope you found that useful. And just to finish, here's a link to the book, and that also includes a discount, a 20% discount code if you go to the publisher's website, and also some more details about how you can find out more about e-learning accessibility training that I offer, and also how you can contact me.
Great, so thank you, Susie, so much for sharing your brilliant top tips. There'll be an opportunity to pose questions to Susie at the end of the session, so please do post your questions to her in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end. So next up we have James Baverstock, who's Senior Accessibility and Usability Consultant at AbilityNet.
Thanks, Annie. As we approach the final deadline this week for the accessibility regulations, with mobile apps coming into scope, we thought it may be useful to give a quick recap on the regulations and what they say overall, as well as speaking a bit about how they specifically apply to mobile apps, and then also giving a few general tips on compliance. So next slide, please. So we use PSBAR as kind of a handy abbreviation for the regulations, and their full title is a bit long-winded. So the full title is the Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018. So we use PSBAR potentially as abbreviation. You may also hear them referred to just as the accessibility regulations. And these originated as an EU directive, but they're now incorporated fully into UK law, so they're not affected by Brexit. And these have three main aspects. Firstly, that websites, intranets, online documents and apps have to comply with accessibility requirements to be perceivable, operable, understandable and robust, basically the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as we'll talk about a bit more in a second. Secondly, that websites and apps must have an accessibility statement, so a published statement saying how accessible they are and how to contact you if people have any problems. And then finally, the government is required to monitor compliance. So this involves regular monitoring where the government sample a percentage of sites each year from different types of organisations. And they use initially a combination of automated checks and quick manual checks and in-depth audits for certain sites. And then send out reports to institutions that they've tested, giving them time to fix issues. And then the regulations overall are enforced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Britain. But it's important to see PSBAR as working alongside and being complementary to the UK Equality Act 2010, which puts a legal obligation to provide equal access for people with disabilities for all services for organisations. And also the Public Sector Equality Duty 2011, which places a special responsibility on public sector bodies to be proactive in dealing with access needs. And PSBAR kind of sits on top of these. It provides much more specific rules and a specific way to monitor compliance. But any specific actions against organisations would be taken using the Equality and Human Rights Commission's powers under the Equality Act. So PSBAR isn't separate from or overriding the Equality Act. It's part of a framework that includes the Equality Act. And the regulations apply to a lot of websites. So we're saying here about 44,000 UK websites, and it includes all public funded organisations except non-governmental organisations like charities, unless they provide essential public services or they're aimed at disabled people, schools or nurseries, except for the content the public need to use their services, and public sector broadcasters and their subsidiaries. And importantly, it also includes third-party content and tools which are under the control of the public body. So this includes content and tools on websites or intranets that you've paid or contracted for. So it can include things like online library services, recruitment systems, portals, and so on, which makes it potentially quite wide-ranging. Next slide, please. And the standard, the accessibility standard, which is mandated in the regulations, is the European Procurement Standard EN 301549. But in practice, this is aligned to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, level A and AA. So effectively, when you're dealing with websites, it basically is the same as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's some variations for non-web documents and apps. But essentially, it's using the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the international standard developed by the W3C, which has this acronym PAW for the key principles that content should be perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. So perceivable, meaning that you should have things like alternate text for informative images, captions for video and so on. Operable in terms of being potentially keyboard operable for people who can't use a mouse. Understandable, and examples of this may be having good instructions and error messages for forms. And robust in terms of making sure that you're following standards so that your web pages will work reliably across platforms and across assistive technologies. And there is a primer we've got a link to here on the gov.uk site, which is a useful getting started guide. But WCAG is complicated. And as Susie mentioned in her presentation, her book translates WCAG specifically to be relevant for learning content. So that might be a useful first place to start if you're specifically interested in learning in particular. Next slide, please. And there are particular exclusions for the regulations. So downloadable documents published before September 2018 are excluded unless they are in active use. So for example, forms or supporting documents for current services. Pre-recorded media like videos and podcasts published before September 2020 is out of scope, but any video that you've published or audio published since last September should be accessible. Live video is out of scope, but the regulations allow for a 14-day gap. So if you've run your video live, you've then got 14 days before you need to add captions to it on your site. Online maps and mapping services are out of scope if accessible alternatives are available. So this refers to services such as Google Maps. And third-party content that's not under the control of the public sector body concerned is also excluded. It's considered under someone else's control if it's something that you didn't pay for, or if you didn't develop it yourself. An example that's given in the guidelines are social media like buttons, which is something that's commonly used that you're not specifically contracting for and you're not paying for. And then a final exclusion is archived websites. And also it should be added that as well as the formal exclusions, organisations can also claim disproportionate burden if there's particular content that would be too burdensome for them to make compliant. But that needs a specific assessment of the burden that you're claiming against the benefits that making something accessible may have, considering things like the size and resources of the organisation, and the cost to fix versus the impact of making things accessible for people with disabilities. There's some things potentially to consider there if you were thinking about claiming disproportionate burden. So next slide, please. As I mentioned, another key part of the regulations is that you need to publish an accessibility statement. So this needs to include an evaluation of the accessibility of your site. So whether it's fully compliant, partially compliant, or not compliant. And the expectation is that a lot of sites will be partially compliant, as full compliance for a large, constantly changing site is very difficult to achieve. But the most important thing is that you've done testing and that you know what problems you have. And then you can document in your statement which parts of your service don't meet accessibility standards and why, and provide alternatives to content that's not accessible, if possible, or at least give people contact details that they can contact you for if you need to provide, if you can provide things in an alternative format. And very importantly, providing a way to contact you to report accessibility problems. And then a link also to the website that they can use if they're not happy with your response. So how someone can actually escalate a complaint if you haven't dealt with their issue properly. And this is a compulsory part of the template that's available for accessibility statements on gov.uk. But as well as these compulsory aspects, it's also good to think about accessibility statements more positively as an opportunity to communicate to your users about how you can support their access needs. So it's potentially an opportunity to highlight accessible services that you could provide. And in a higher education context, for example, you could use it to signpost support that you have for students, facilitate early requests for alternative formats and reasonable adjustments, and importantly, manage expectations so that, for example, students don't waste time trying to access a particular resource if it's not going to work for them. Next slide, please. So the timeline for implementing regulations. So the first deadline was September 2019. And at that point, websites published after the 23rd of September 2018 came into scope, and new intranet and extranet content published after that point. Older intranet content remains out of scope until you do a major revision of it, and then it comes into scope. And then in September 2020, websites created before 23rd September 2018 came into scope. So from this point last year, all websites have basically been in scope. And then finally, we're just coming up to the final deadline this week, that mobile apps are now going to be in scope. So this is the last deadline in the implementation timeline. And if we go to the next slide. So mobile apps coming into scope this month. By mobile apps, this refers to native mobile apps for iOS or Android. So the type of apps that would generally be available from an app store, not desktop web apps, which are already covered under the regulations as they stand. So if you have in-house developed apps, you need to make sure that they are checked for accessibility. Most public sector organisations are more likely to use third-party apps. Now here there's something important to note, that the CDDO, the Central Digital and Data Office, which was formerly part of GDS, they issued last week updated guidance on exactly what types of third-party app actually apply and are in scope. Actually, the regulations apply for and are in scope. And they've clarified that in order for third-party apps to be in scope, both of the following must apply. So mobile apps designed and developed on behalf of public sector body are in scope, but not unbranded off-the-shelf apps. And these apps also have to be in use by the general public. So not just for specifically defined groups, such as employees or students. So this is definitely worth noting as it differs from the advice on websites and intranets, where services for employees and students are included. And this amendment to the guidelines does reduce considerably what third-party apps are going to be in scope for most organisations, as against what I think the general understanding of the scope of the regulations was up until last week. But it must be said at the same time that any apps that are not covered directly by the accessibility regulations are still covered by the Equality Act 2010, the Public Sector Equality Duty, which I mentioned before, and the Public Contracts Regulations, which state that all technology that's procured for the public sector should be accessible. So it doesn't sort of let third-party apps off the hook altogether in terms of accessibility. But this was issued just last week as an article on the GISC website, and there's a link to that on the AbilityNet site, and the actual gov.uk guidance should be updated to reflect this in due course. So if your third-party apps are in scope, obviously, ideally, you want to speak to suppliers and get a statement published as soon as possible. So the deadline is tomorrow, so it's probably a bit late in the day now, but obviously you'd still want to get something up there as soon as possible if you hadn't met the deadline. If your third-party app is in scope, as a minimum, you want to provide at least a link to any accessibility information that they provide. So if they have something like a VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template, which is like something that's more used in the US generally than here, but is a description of the accessibility of the product, that it doesn't exactly necessarily match up to an accessibility statement, but something like that would be much better than nothing in terms of having something to link to. And critically, as well as that, you want to provide a link to how someone could contact you if they have any problems with the app. Next slide, please. And the requirements for apps, they're basically the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, levels A and AA. But there are some success criteria that don't apply to mobile apps. And these are listed in EN 301549, which has a section 11 on non-web software. I think these are also included in on the gov.uk site around the regulations. So there's just certain parts of WCAG that don't apply. This is quite commonsensical, so it tends to be parts that really only relate to web pages and are only really sensible to test for web pages, such as consistent navigation and consistent identification between pages, the requirement that web pages be titled, and so on. When you do your accessibility statements for apps, they should be available on the website of the public sector body that developed the app, or alongside other information available when downloading the application. But the best practice is also to make it available from within the app. And the NHS app is an app which everyone can potentially access, that is a good example of having the accessibility statement linked to within the app. I think earlier versions of earlier drafts of the guidelines did say that it should be published on the App Store as well, but this seems to be something that's not currently possible. So this isn't something that you currently need to worry about. Potentially too, you need to think about doing separate testing for the Android and iOS versions of the apps, because they're likely to have different types of problem. And that might also necessitate having separate statements for Android and iOS as well. So next slide, please. And then just to finish up, I've just got a few top tips on complying with the regulations and accessibility in general. So the first one is, and this may seem really obvious, but don't forget to update your accessibility statements. So historically, before these regulations, I think accessibility statements on websites, they often tended to get posted and then never get updated. But it's an important part of PSBAR that statements are supposed to be living documents. So you really need to review your statement regularly. So potentially at least once a year. But if you have a site where you do a lot of updates, then potentially you're obviously going to want to review it more regularly, and certainly when you do major changes. And you want to have those reviews in your calendar in advance to make absolutely sure that the statement is getting updated appropriately. And similarly, something else which is probably pretty obvious is to remember to test new features as you add them to sites. But there was a recent gov.uk blog on common problems that have been noticed with the public sector accessibility regulations. And they specifically mentioned there that they noticed that features like cookie banners, coronavirus pop-ups or overlays are getting added to sites and potentially not tested. And features like modal overlays and pop-ups can be particularly problematic for accessibility. So they're always worth fully checking for issues like keyboard accessibility and reading order with screen readers and so on. So it's important that even if you're adding small features, that you have a consistent way to test for, record, and fix your new issues. And ideally that you have some form of roadmap that can be aligned with your accessibility statement. So it makes it much easier to manage. It's good also to make sure that you're taking full advantage of any user feedback that you get. So you want to make sure that any feedback you get about accessibility can be fed back appropriately to the people who need to fix issues. Getting feedback from users, I mean, we sometimes say that it could be thought of as a bit like getting free user testing from people with disabilities. So it can be really valuable. So you want to make sure that when you get that feedback, you're taking advantage of the opportunity to make appropriate changes. And you want to make sure overall that your complaint process is robust. And that when people complain that they're getting an appropriate response. The next tip is around just taking advantage of automated checkers. So automated checkers can't necessarily check for everything, but they can be very useful for ongoing checking, and the amount of your site that they can cover. And they can also be useful and educative nowadays for non-expert users, because they often provide detail about why they're reporting on things. So they can be useful in an educative way as well. And if your developers use checkers such as Axe during their development process, you can avoid issues actually getting onto your site in the first place. With documents, using the Microsoft Office Accessibility Checker, if everybody in the organization uses that, that can be a really good thing for reducing number of issues around document accessibility. So it's good to use automated checkers, potentially too, though, because they have a limited test coverage. They can't check for everything. So it's good to combine them potentially with other basic, making basic, other basic checks well known as well. And gov.uk has got information on doing a basic accessibility check if you can't do a detailed one, which goes through some basic checks. And at AbilityNet, we run regular training, a training session on how to begin your own accessibility testing, where we discuss some basic checks that are aligned with those. It sounds like Susi's book would be a good way to show basic checks for e-learning as well. Or there are also the Sculpt guidelines for documents from Helen Wilson at Worcestershire County Council, which have been mentioned on the AbilityNet site before as well. So there's a range of potentially basic checks, types of basic check that you could popularise alongside automated checks. And this is a way of spreading accessibility knowledge widely through your organisation potentially. And the final point here says just not to rely on a few experts, because having a limited number of people with accessibility expertise can be a bottleneck, can cause problems when experts leave the organisation. So as Susie said, it's important to make sure that to work across your organisation when you're talking about accessibility, and to have involve a range of people, and popularizing automated checkers alongside basic checks can get more content creators thinking about accessibility. Potentially you might want to think about other techniques like developing a network of accessibility champions, so people within teams who can act as advocates for accessibility as well, and that can be a great way to build internal capability and spread expertise as well. And again, I think there's a number of articles on the AbilityNet site about that. So that's everything that I wanted to cover in this recap.
Great. Well, thanks so much, James. Some brilliant tips and advice there. I'm sure you've all got a lot of questions to ask Susie and James, and we've had lots of questions come through. I doubt we'll manage to cover everything right now, so just a reminder that we'll capture any unanswered questions and share the responses on our website in the next couple of days, and you'll be sent a link to access them. So just to go through the questions now, we had a question to both of you. Are you familiar with the platform Brightspace? If so, do you have any key tips for academics that build on this VLE? Does that ring any bells to either of you?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Sorry, no.
Okay. We can investigate that and take a look into that one. Okay. This one is about captions and videos. Can I ask the best and accessible way to put closed captions onto videos that do not have captions? We want to ensure that all learning videos are accessible to all. Do either of you have particular advice on that particular topic?
I think it depends upon how they're producing the videos. So if you're we can probably put in the links later on some links to different captioning tools that you can potentially use. I mean, if you're using YouTube, then you can use the captioning. You can edit the captions directly within there, and depending on what package what you're using, you can potentially there are potentially different ways of adding and editing captions. We can potentially put a few. We could potentially provide a few links on different different captioning tools that we'd recommend, I think.
Okay, yeah. And a question that came in earlier was, what is the most, or in your opinion, what's the most accessible tool for quizzes? Don't know if you've come across anything like that.
So yeah, I think a lot of the tools that are available nowadays are actually getting much better for making their quizzes accessible. So I wouldn't be able to recommend a particular one, but I think probably all of the sort of market leaders are much better now on producing quizzes that do have accessibility, so our keyboard and screen reader accessible. So I think one that is might be worth having a look at is one called CourseArc, and that one is quite useful because what it does, the kind of advantage over other tools is that it automatically, if you're using a quiz format that isn't accessible, for example, a drag and drop, it automatically will provide you with an accessible version without you having to think about it. So as I say, most authoring tools, sort of standard e-learning authoring tools, are getting much better on making sure that their quiz options are accessible. But there are some that, you know, like I say with CourseArc, that's an interesting one because it kind of does it for you without having to think about it.
Okay, and a question about the public sector bodies' accessibility regulations. Are old intranets that have not undergone a big update out of scope still?
So as far as I know, yes. I think it's at the point where you undertake a major, the point where you undertake a major update, redesign them, etc. That's the point where they're then going to come into scope, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. Do you have any advice or pointers to resources or research on how to effectively present bilingual information in accessible formats? Could be to both of you. No. We can take a look into that and come back to that one in the typed responses. We have, our library subscribes to a number of resources which have a companion app, such as Times Higher Education. Are those apps in scope? Are you aware of whether those apps are in scope?
So under the update to the regulations that was published last week, if the app if it's completely off the shelf, so if if it's not aimed at the general public, then presumably it would not be, it wouldn't be in scope. If we're talking about a mobile, if this is a mobile app, then it wouldn't be in scope. Okay.
That's the impression I get, but we can again we can come back to that in the typed responses. Another question, or just some comments about the No Coffee Vision Simulator tool that came through earlier on in the webinar. Just to mention, the link doesn't seem to be available anymore, so we're going to investigate an alternative link and again put that in the webinar notes afterwards. So
I think that may have, it was available on Chrome. I think it may only be available on Firefox now. Just very recently, it's just been changed. So yeah, we can update that, no problem.
Okay, great. A question for Susie, which was, how do you encourage people to engage with meeting accessibility targets?
So I think when you mean accessibility targets, we're talking about making it accessible to the web content accessibility guidelines. Yeah. So I think sort of encouraging that is it just depends really on the situation that you're in. So I think there's always the kind of, it's making the case for accessibility really. So one of the things that I think is really effective that I spoke about in the presentation was seeing how accessibility or particularly non-accessible learning can affect your learners. So if you can have any experience of people sort of having to you know, to cope with the issues that might be created by barriers that you're sort of unadvertently putting in your e-learning, is one of the best ways, I think, of really having sort of that eye-opening, you know, what effect you're creating if you're not making things accessible. And I think also it's always coming back to the case again, is that, you know, looking at the ethical case, the legal case, the business case, the learning case. It's all those different aspects that you can bring into trying to encourage people to make their e-learning accessible. So I think it really depends on, you know, who your target audience is, who you're talking to. Okay, yeah.
We've got loads and loads of questions coming through, and I'm aware that we're quickly running out of time. So just another couple of questions. Can I get your views on document and form accessibility? There's a risk they're overlooked when you talk about websites. And in the public sector and higher education, there's a lot of document, principally PDF usage. Do you have any comments to make on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where it's particularly word forms in particular are notoriously difficult to make accessible. They don't work well. PDFs in general, of course, there's problems with. But you can make a PDF form accessible, but you have to go through certain hoops to do that. I think when we run our PDF accessibility training sessions, we do cover PDF form accessibility. But when we talk about that, we always preface that with saying that generally it can be better potentially to use web forms, because the big web form tools like Microsoft Forms and SurveyMonkey are reasonably accessible now. So it can be much easier to go down the web survey route rather than try to use document forms because of the issues around the complexity of making PDF forms accessible.
Okay, great. We just had a few comments saying, could you spell the name of the quiz tool? We will again add it to the web page with a lot of useful links as well, so you'll receive that. But if you might say for CourseArc, was it?
It's CourseArc, so it's course and that one word, and then the second word is arc, A-R-C.
Okay, great. And then just one more question, which you may be able to answer now, or if not, we'll cover it later. This is for James. Does Turnitin, which is linked cloud software via VLE, come under the apps regulations? Yeah, do you have a comment about that?
So I'm not familiar with it. So if it is a mobile app, as opposed to a web app, so if it's specifically a native mobile app, then if it's specifically aimed at the students, then I think probably taking what was published last week, you could have a look at the exact text of the guidance that was published last week, which I think we've got should have a link. There's a link to in the slides, but that does say specifically that apps for specific defined groups such as employees or students are not covered by the accessibility regulations for mobile apps. So it says mobile apps need to be for use by the general public, which would suggest that if the software is specifically for students, then it wouldn't be within the regulations. But I think do look at the guidance that came out last week yourself and have a look at that. But my interpretation of it would be that that would not come within the regulations.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for your questions, and to James and Susie for answering them. And like I say, there'll be some text responses on our website in the next few days. So just looking at the time, I think it's time to wrap up now. So just to let you know, we also run online training sessions on digital accessibility, and you can find out more at abilitynet.org/training. Courses coming up include this week how to produce accessible videos, and then on the 8th of July how to begin your own accessibility testing, and on the 14th of July PDF accessibility, as James mentioned. And then next slide please, Adam. We recently launched our e-learning modules for higher education and further education, and you can find out more about them at /e-learning-modules. And you could also download the free McNaught and AbilityNet HE and FE maturity model at /maturity model. And if you'd like to discuss any of those, please do get in contact. And we also have various accessibility services on our website as well. And then finally, we have, you can also sign up to our AbilityNet newsletter at /newsletter. And don't forget about our next free webinars. Our next one is on the 29th of June, next Tuesday, about how to excel at inclusive onboarding and induction. And then on the 6th of July, we've got Richard Morton from the UK government in our next Accessibility Insights interview session. And then on the 20th of July, the business case for accessibility. So thanks again, Susie and James, and everyone that's joined us, and we'll be in touch soon. And please do fill out the feedback form that will appear at the end of the webinar. So thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.